Please welcome Frank Quinlan to the stage. And as I say, it's a very impressive bio, and you ought to have a look at it in your own spare time. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, mate. You're too kind. Thank you very much. That was a very kind welcome. And thanks for the welcome to country. And thanks in particular for our consumers and carers for sharing those stories of hope. Part of the reason I'm thanking you, I have to say, is that my presentation could be read by some as being a little bit pessimistic. I'm coming from Canberra at the moment, and I've described in other settings that it's a particularly tough environment at the moment. And when I was thinking about this presentation, I thought about it is loud, isn't it? I thought about a show called The Newsroom. I don't know if people have seen an American show called The Newsroom. Who's seen that show? Thanks. There's a particular episode where they end up interviewing on the big national news program in America. They end up interviewing this guy who's unauthorised from the Environmental Protection Authority. And he's not meant to be doing the interview, but somehow through a turn of circumstance he gets to give the presentation on the news anyway. And the newsreader isn't very interested really in the issues, but says, so what are we going to do about climate change to this guy? And he just says, it's too late. The guy says, what do you mean it's too late? And he says, no, we reached the tipping point about 10 years ago on climate change. And so then the interview slowly progresses into the picture that this guy paints of rising sea levels, population unrest, worldwide calamity and famine and so on, all because he's unauthorised to speak on this show. So I hope my presentation doesn't end up quite as pessimistic as his, but I do hope I give you a sense of what some of the difficulties in the current environment that we face in mental health are at the moment. So we're trying to progress mental health reform and trying to look at exactly what it is that brought us to where we are now, exactly what it is that the current wheels that are in motion that we can look to turn and influence, and where we need to take the reform process from here. Because if we're unable to take the reform process forward, then I fear we face some really significant crises in future. I want to begin though by, my clicker doesn't seem to be quite doing its job, there we go, by just talking broadly about where mental health has been and the problem that we've had with mental health reform for a long time. Because some of you will have read a report like John Mendoza's obsessive hope disorder report that outlines, in effect, there have been something like an inquiry into mental health reform every 18 months for the last 30 years, and that we haven't really managed to crack the nut of reform yet. Having said that, I do think it's important to acknowledge that we're moving forward, that mental health is in a different place now to where it was 30 years ago. And sometimes in our eagerness to ensure that we're moving forward and our eagerness to see things constantly improve, it's easy to forget that we are in fact moving forward, and none of us would want to turn the clock back to where we were 30 years ago or so. That picture was taken outside the Indigenous Tent Embassy in Canberra about 3 years ago, and I think it sort of captures for a sense of some of us the sort of forlorn nature of that reform process. So I want to begin by really just quickly talking about some of the historic sort of bits and pieces that have got us to where we are now, and then I'll move on to where we're going next. So the context for our discussion is that we've had our 4th National Mental Health Plan. Some of you may or may not be aware that we're just coming to the end of that 4th plan. I sometimes say to people in my work in Canberra, which is a long way from Grasmere Youth Services, which is was a little non-government service in the sort of post-industrial suburbs of Doveton in Melbourne, that I sometimes feel like my work takes me into episodes of The Hollowmen. You're getting a sense I watch a bit of television sometimes. Who watches The Hollowmen or seen that episode, a political satire? Sometimes I feel like my work's in that. This gives me a chance to tell just a quick story that's only a distraction, but I think it's funny. I was discussing the end of the 4th National Mental Health Plan with an advisor to the government some considerable time ago, so that they can remain nameless. But I said, so what are we going to do about the 5th National Mental Health Plan? Because we're coming to the end of the 4th National Mental Health Plan, and wouldn't it be good if we got going in the conversation early so that we could develop a decent plan, a decent response to follow it? And he looked at me with a dead straight face and with no irony in his voice and with no humour in his voice and said, Frank, there isn't going to be a 5th National Mental Health Plan, but there will be a successor to the 4th. And that tells you a little bit about the sort of the depth with which some of these plans are considered when they're considered in Canberra. We've got, as well as the 4th National Mental Health Plan ending, we've got the rollout of a whole lot of initiatives from the 2011 budget, including Partners in Recovery, that's really, in my view anyway, just getting underway. I look forward to hearing over the next couple of days how the Partners in Recovery program is going here, but it seems to me fair and reasonable to expect that a program is going to take some time to get going, and we're going to take some time to learn about it and evaluate it and do it better over time. And so some of those initiatives from the 2011 budget are still just happening. The last sort of Commonwealth statement on the reform process was the 10-year roadmap. Anybody here remember the 10-year roadmap? It's telling, isn't it? 4 or 5 hands in the room recognise the last government's plan for mental health reform called the 10-year roadmap for mental health. Sorry? More like a dead end, says a leader. Couldn't possibly comment a leader. I'm on a videotape here. We've had the first and second reports of the National Mental Health Commission. So the National Mental Health Commission was still relatively newly established in order to report annually on progress of mental health and suicide prevention in Australia. And all of those things are really just things that are just starting to happen. But we've got a whole raft of other major reforms that are occurring at the same time. So I tend in the mental health space to have a focus tightly on some of the issues that we face out of the Department of Health and other places. But there's a whole raft of reform processes that are occurring at the same time. So we had and are still feeling the implications or the effects of the government's Commission of Audit. The government held a Commission of Audit when they came into government. And some of the implications of that audit are just being felt now. You might have heard some of the press about changes to the Health Department's flexible funds. We're still feeling impacts of those reforms that were measured. We've got a huge implementation of the NDIS that's underway, and I think broadly as a sector, as I'll get a chance to say a little bit later on, I think we hugely underestimate the impact of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and its implications for the mental health sector broadly and for mental health programs. And I'll talk about that a little bit. At the same time as all of this is happening in the health space, we've got reforms happening in the Department of Social Services and other places. Patrick McClure was asked to review the welfare system. One of the things that the National Mental Health Commission found when it reviewed mental health was that the vast bulk of Commonwealth Government spending in the mental health space is in fact on the disability support pension. That's by far one of the biggest programs that of Commonwealth spending. And so the implications of something like the welfare reform or Twiggy Forrest was asked to do a review of Indigenous employment, but extended his brief, I think, considerably to make comment on a whole raft of welfare issues as well. And so the implications of those reforms are going to be huge. We've got the Commonwealth and state governments negotiating and renegotiating over Commonwealth housing agreements at the moment. I'm not sitting under any of that, so I'm not as nervous as you might be now. We've got the Commonwealth Government and the state governments negotiating over housing, and clearly you don't have to scratch too far into mental health to realise that housing and stable accommodation, appropriate accommodation, is one of the most important things that we can provide in this space. We also have a process underway which is the Prime Minister's own little baby, if you like, called the Federation White Paper process, which is looking to essentially refashion Commonwealth and state relations. So that's a huge reform. Again, one of the things that the National Mental Health Commission found, as we'll see in a minute when they reviewed mental health, is that one of the core problems that we have in the mental health space is that the breakdown at the point at which Commonwealth programs and state government programs either interact or don't interact or create gaps or overlaps is hugely important. We worked very hard at Mental Health Australia to ensure that mental health was considered as part of the first raft of papers. So the Health White Paper that's part of this process highlights mental health as one of the main areas of concern and one of the main areas where state and Commonwealth government relations could be renegotiated, but we're yet to see, and we'll see over the coming 6 months, we're yet to see exactly where that's likely to land. Then, as I said, and I'll talk a little bit more at the moment, we have some sort of really highlight issues, burning issues happening right now. We have the National Mental Health Commission have just released their report into programs and services. Well, I should say government have just released their report. The National Mental Health Commission provided their report to government in November last year, and the report's only just made it out into the public domain now. I won't dwell here because I'll talk a little bit about that more. But at the same time, the government have announced a review of Medicare and are intending to go through every Medicare item in the schedule and to determine whether they're getting good value for money out of it, whether it's the right investment or not. So clearly there are items there that have pretty big impact or could potentially have a big impact on mental health. And we also, in parallel to that, also have a process that's been announced to review primary health care, which again is something a little bit broader than simply the Medicare review, but likely, again, I think to have really significant impacts in the space, because one of the things that the Commission found is that we need to look at that whole primary healthcare space and possibly make some very significant changes if we're going to achieve the sorts of reforms that all of us would want in this space. And they talk particularly, and I'll go into some detail in a moment, about the primary health networks and the impact that moving to primary health networks will have on the mental health space. So one of the areas that was considered as part of this, needs to be considered as part of this reform process, is that the Commission's report was part of government policy. So the National Mental Health Commission report is in effect a sort of child of this own government, the coalition government's own policy. So before the election they said that their mental health policy was going to be to conduct a review. Now that's frustrating for those of us who would say there've been review after review after review, we just need to get on with it and do it. But it's a positive in the sense that now they have this review, I think we have a stronger chance of holding the government to account for implementing its findings, because it was in fact their initiative. So as I said, the main thing that, or the sort of headline, if you like, of findings that the Commission found in their review, 750-page review. Hands up, everybody who's read all 750 pages. 3 of us in the room. Well done. It found that of the something near $10 billion of expenditure that is spent in this space, the vast bulk of that spending was in items like the disability support pension, in demand-driven programs, not in the sorts of programs and services that the NGOs here in Tasmania are offering. That was found to be something less than 5% of Commonwealth spending spent nationally was on NGOs, which is, I think a tiny percentage. They said, and rightly so, and I'm afraid my eyes aren't good enough to read it off the back, so I'm going to read it here, but they said that the main thing that we need to do if we're going to address the demand-driven nature of that spending is to look at reorienting our program toward early intervention and prevention. So the main shift in focus, and it's consistent with many of the findings of other reviews in the past, is that we need to shift that focus to early intervention and prevention. They recommended that we redirect that spending. They said that they thought if we just tweaked a little bit of the government, the growth in government spending that is projected to go towards hospitals and the acute setting over the next decade, if we just took a little bit out of that growth budget, that would result in $1 billion that could be spent on early intervention and prevention over that time. That was their main recommendation. They also recommended that primary health networks be renamed, that they be renamed and refashioned to become primary and mental health networks, and that they be the focus of integration of future programs, that we pool funding through those primary health networks, and that as a result of that funding being pooled and as a result of a single authority being responsible for providing the services in the area, that we'd get better integration of services. They said that we need to use that rollout of that change to create a stepped care approach, which is to say that people get the help they need when they need it in a stepped fashion, so people can move into the system gently but progress if they need to, and progress backwards if they need to. So the idea that you come out of hospital after an acute admission and have no support whatsoever, it would not be part of a stepped care model. You'd come out of an acute setting and you'd step back to a less intensive support, but nonetheless supports in the community. So people can step back and forward through that model. And they also highlighted the need to support interventions for particular communities, LGBTI communities, cultural and linguistically diverse communities, Indigenous communities and others, so that we need to do a better job on focusing. The Commission's report said that we need to clarify Commonwealth Government and state government responsibilities as one of the core sort of areas of reform, which I think is why some of those things like the Federation White Paper process become so important. They said we need to manage the risks around the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that's certainly true, and I'll come in a little more detail to that in a moment. And they said, unsurprisingly, because I think that's where most of the early intervention and prevention services are delivered, that we need to boost mental health workforce and NGO capacity in the sector, particularly, as I'll say, some issues around data and evaluation and monitoring of systems in particular. So what was the government's response? The first thing the government did, I don't know if people followed the release of the report, it was leaked. People remember it was leaked and then the government was forced to respond. It was leaked in the lead up to the Council of Australian Governments meeting just a few days before. And to be honest, when I first saw that it was leaked, I thought this must be a state government who've leaked this report in order to achieve this response from the Commonwealth Government, because it just seemed such awfully bad timing that the Commonwealth Government was forced to essentially say, we're not going to take $1 billion out of state and territory government health budgets. That was never the Commission's proposal, but that was how it was put at the time. And I think that created an enormous amount of political pressure and an enormous setback in terms of sensible review. They also said that they were going to establish an expert reference group. I understand that group is going to meet later this week. It hasn't been announced yet, but a little birdie has told me that group is close to being announced, so we might pay attention later this week to see if that's going to happen. The expert reference group are being established to help the government to respond to the Commission's report, a report of expert commissioners, I might say. The government have also said, as part of their response, that they're going to invite state and territory governments to complete the development of the 5th National Mental Health Plan. And I drew some comfort from the words that the Minister used when she described what the 5th National Mental Health Plan needed to be. She said it needed to be national, needed to be coordinated, and needed to be binding. And I think especially in relation to it being binding, I think there's a lot of work that we can be doing to ensure that both state and territory governments and Commonwealth Government are actually held to account in terms of the sorts of plans that we have. All of this is to happen by December. And I'll go on to say why it has to happen by December in a moment. But if you get a sense of where my sense of pessimism might come from in relation to some of this, that's the core. And I'm about to paint a picture as to why this reform process has to happen by December. I don't know if people are familiar with a movie called The Perfect Storm, where they sailed off into the Caribbean, I think, and 3 storms all came together in the one place, and poor old George Clooney faced a terrible wave. If you come into our office some days in recent months, this is a picture that you could take of some of our staff, because all of those sort of reform measures are sort of happening and shaping all at once and coming together. And if you think about then, as we do, what needs to be resolved by December and why it needs to be resolved by December, you'll get a sense of why you get that sort of wide open view. So in terms of what we need to resolve, if we're going to reorient the system towards early intervention and prevention, which is the right recommendation from the Commission and one that's been made over and over again, then I think we have to face the question of where does the money come from. An investment in early intervention and prevention is a long-term investment, because if I invest money today and if I get it right immediately, the saving is likely to be 10, even 20 years down the track. So I invest today to ensure that people don't become ill, or if they do become ill, they don't become as ill as they otherwise might. And that means that 10 years down the track, they're not in an acute setting, they're not in a hospital, they're not in an intensive residential support program that's really, really expensive. But it means we've got to find the money up front, or we can't make that investment. It also means, I think, that we have to be looking much more closely at what we're doing in the raft of other services that fill the lives of people, pardon me, that fill the lives of people who are experiencing early onset mental illness. So it's not just about mental health programs in the traditional health space, and the Commission's report focused mostly on programs in the health space. It's about how we interact with employment services and housing services and other supports that are in the community. If we're going to resolve questions around PHNs, and if we're going to have these primary health networks being responsible for pooling funds and integrating services, then in the mental health space, I think we've got a lot of questions to ask. I think we have to ask which programs are going to be included and which are not. We have to get the governance right, because if we don't get the governance right, then are we going to face a situation where primary health networks, which are mostly focused on, or have been set up to mostly focus on clinical health issues in the community, are they going to adequately address the breadth of issues in the mental health space? And are we going to have people with sound knowledge of mental health, and particularly community-based mental health, involved in the governance of those organisations? And how are we going to deal with the juggernaut of the National Disability Insurance Scheme? I just want to pause briefly to talk about why I think the National Disability Insurance Scheme is so important here. And I'm not sure that people, as I keep saying, have recognised this quite as much as being quite as important as I think it is. The National Disability Insurance Scheme was created by Australian governments, by the Commonwealth Government and by state and territory governments for good purpose, and we're fans of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The idea is, it's set up around the idea of individual choice and control for people who've experienced disability, and gives them both the resources and the authority and the independence to build a tranche of supports around them that they need, and that's a noble ambition. In order to do that, governments had to create a huge new bucket of money, essentially, or resources. So in order to provide the NDIS as envisaged, government said, okay, well, we're all going to chip in a large amount of money. They increased the Medicare levy in order to help them do that. But they also said, and this is where the catch is for us, I think, they also said we're also going to throw in a whole raft of programs that look a bit like the NDIS, or could look a bit like the NDIS. Pardon me. So, programs like Partners in Recovery are one of the programs that have been thrown into that NDIS bucket. So they said, well, Partners in Recovery looks a bit like it could be something like the NDIS, so we'll put that into the bucket. Programs like Personal Helpers and Mentors have gone into the bucket. Programs like Mental Health Carer Respite, sounds a bit like NDIS, we'll put it all in the bucket. So all of these programs were put into the bucket when the Commonwealth and state governments negotiated their agreements around the NDIS. But I thank you, that's very kind. I don't know what's happened to my throat this morning. I might not have had enough coffee or something. Thank you very much. So all of that went into the NDIS bucket. But what nobody did was say, are the people who are in those programs also going to receive programs from the NDIS? Excuse me. An ad for Grim Water, is it? Cape Grim Water. I sounded last night and was very impressed with how clean. Have you read the back of the label of Cape Grim Water? Because it's collected where the pollution is between 0 and 600 particles per million, and in the capital city where you come from, it can be up to 500,000 particles per million. So we have a situation now where the NDIS has been created by virtue of these government agreements, and happily so, and a whole raft of people in the mental health space. They estimate that 57,000 people with severe and persistent mental illness with multi-agency needs are going to get an intensive support package out of the NDIS, which is great if you're one of those people. But if you're not one of those people, then the fear is that we've created an oasis that's now sitting in the middle of a desert, because all of those other programs have sort of been sucked up into the NDIS. We estimate, or the government estimates actually, there's something like 600,000 people in Australia with severe mental illness. Something like upwards of 200,000 of those people have intensive and individual support needs. And so our growing concern around the NDIS is what's left in the wake of those government's agreements. If we're going to have governments agree to a new national mental health plan, then as the Commission recommends, and rightly recommends, we need to find some way of ensuring that we have targets and indicators. So we actually have a set of targets that say, this is what the National Mental Health Plan is going to achieve, and this is how we're going to measure it, because we haven't had that adequately expressed before. And as I said earlier, we keep saying this over and over again. I'd encourage you to keep saying it over and over again, and to encourage your friends to keep saying it over and over again. The Minister said the national agreement needs to be national, coordinated and binding. And especially binding, because as the little show of hands around the 10-year roadmap for mental health showed before, there's a great propensity in Canberra to develop these sort of documents that sit on a shelf and go nowhere. We also have a question, I think, about how governments get held to account. So at the moment, the National Mental Health Commission, which has done, I think, a great job of producing its first 2 report cards on mental health, and has just done another good job of reviewing mental health across Australia. It's set up as a Commonwealth Government initiative, and we're going to need some sort of mechanism in order to hold not just the Commonwealth Government to account, but state governments to account also. If we had an NDIS that's going to mitigate the risk around if we had a mental health system that's going to manage the risks around the National Disability Insurance Scheme, then as a matter of urgency, we're saying somebody needs to do that reconciliation that we've talked about before. We had the opportunity to present to the what's called the Alcohol and Drug Principal Committee just a couple of weeks ago, and we presented precisely this problem to them. Because it's not a problem just for the NDIS, it's not a job that the NDIS need to do, it's not a job that the Commonwealth Government need to do on their own around programs outside Commonwealth Government funded programs, and it's not a program that state governments can do. What we need to have is some reconciled study of where programs are delivered, who's part of those programs and who's responsible for delivering them. We keep saying we're agnostic about who provides support. I don't care if you get support from the National Disability Insurance Scheme, from an ongoing Commonwealth Government program, or from a state government program. As long as you get the right support from one of those programs. We're agnostic. What we haven't done is reconcile that. The other thing that we need to do, and again, the couple of slides that I'll present in a minute will paint a picture of the urgency of this, is to ensure that the transitional arrangements that we have in place don't create gaps. So we're fast approaching an important deadline, and we need to ensure that as we're moving from the state that we're in now to the state that we all believe we need to be, which is a different one, you know, the governments aren't going to get any opposition from people saying we want the system to stay the same as it is today, because I think there's broad widespread agreement that it's not the right system. But we need to really carefully plan the steps in the process, and in particular, we need to make sure that the new services and programs are up and running before old services and programs are withdrawn. And again, I'm privileged enough to be in conversation with a lot of the public servants who are planning these initiatives. I talk to the government policymakers and others. I haven't yet seen that plan laid out that says, here's how new programs will be up and running, and we'll know that they're going to be able to reliably deliver services to people. Here they are up and running before these old programs are withdrawn. And finally, I think if we're going to have a system that has better planning and better data, and our system should have better planning and better data, again, as the Commission recommended, we need to build the capacity of non-government organisations in order to do it. So the Commission's report says we need non-government organisations on the ground delivering services, and we need more of them. And it also says that we need those organisations to be more able to collect data, to be able to manage data, to be able to integrate their data with things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Again, the question for mine is, who's going to make that investment? Because it's an upfront investment. For years now, we've been saying to NGOs as we've funded them, actually, you can't invest. We're trimming back your funding to such a level that you can pay your wages and not much more. So organisations haven't had the opportunity to invest in capital works, their buildings and so forth. You look at the buildings that NGOs are in, if they're modest, they're often repurposed buildings that have had some previous purpose. They haven't built up wonderful IT systems because the government funding hasn't allowed them to do that. It's another area where we need to invest up front. And we also need to look at who's going to provide training for that workforce. So if we're asking workers to take on a new set of skills and abilities, then that's going to require training and a support process. We also say, or the Commission also said, that it needs staff training beyond the work that's happening in the mental health space for NGOs. So we need training for frontline workers in housing services and employment services and education services, and we need to work out, I think, who's going to provide that training. We need to work out, again, what the order is, what our priority order is, but we also need to work out what we're going to, how we're going to make that investment, because again, these are long-term investments, and you'll hear me come at the end to talk about why I think we really need to be developing a 10-year plan around this rather than the usual sort of short-term plans of government. So that was a look really at the National Mental Health Commission and all of the things that the National Mental Health Commission recommended, and some of the challenges that I think this expert reference group, which rumour has it might be meeting later this week or might be announced later this week, they're just some of the things that they will have to respond to before we're able to say we have a 5th National Mental Health Plan and we have a good plan around the NDIS. Excuse me just a moment again for your grim water. Spend a little bit of time talking about why it is that this crisis is so important, or why the timing of this crisis is so important. Hands up people who were acutely aware of the crisis that we just faced in terms of the funding of mental health programs coming up to the end of this financial year. How many people were affected by that? That's about 10 times more people than read the National Mental Health Commission's 750 pages of report. This is what happened. So we had a federal election in 2013 that meant, the usual change of government sorts of issues, not to be unexpected. The government, following their election, said that they were going to commit to the policy that they'd announced prior to the election. They announced that the National Mental Health Commission would conduct a review of programs and services. So what that essentially meant then was that government had licence then to say, well, everything's on hold now because we're doing a review. So there was a 12-month hiatus, really, where a whole lot of programs and services went on hold, and none of us really knew what was going to come out at the end of it. The problem was that in the middle of that hiatus period, a whole raft of contracts for organisations who were delivering services were due to expire. Now, I'm always careful to say, because sometimes we're accused of being sort of a bit of an industry body, we're just in the interests of service providers, which is, I have to say, patently untrue, but it's a criticism that's made of us by government sometimes. The end of contracts doesn't just mean the end of contracts and an inconvenience for service providers. It means that people on the ground who rely on these programs and services for day-to-day support run the risk of missing out. And that's why our concern comes up around the end of contracts. So, at the last minute, in the month before they were due to expire, we had a funding extension announced. And the funding extension was for 12 months, which meant we shifted the contracts down the road for 12 months. The phrase is kicking it down the road. We didn't solve the problem, we kicked it down the road. During that period, we then had the National Mental Health Commission providing its report to government in November 2014, so halfway through those contracts roughly. And again, before the government was able to respond, because the government were able to respond to their report, and because the contracts needed renewal, we had again another announcement that the government was going to extend those contracts for 12 months, and that's where we are now. I'm at pains to say the same day that the government announced they were extending the contracts in the mental health space for 12 months, Mental Health Australia got a letter to say ours was extended for 6 months. I'm bitter and twisted about that, but I won't dwell on it here. Now, what we found, and this is why I put these notice periods up, we conducted a survey of our organisations in this space here and asked them about the impact of all this uncertainty. And what we found was that 6 months out, it was in fact 7 months out from the end of contract, 40% of our organisations reported that they had already lost staff because of funding uncertainty. And that's why this period of notice and planning is so important. So what we're saying to government now is that unless you're able to provide certainty to organisations, and not just to organisations but to the people who rely on these services and programs, then you're really having a very detrimental impact on the services and programs on the ground, and that's what we want to avoid. So this is how we see, again, sorry if I'm being pessimistic for anybody, this is how I see the next little period unfolding. We've had the 2015 budget, and it didn't say anything about mental health because essentially now we're waiting on the response to the Commission's review. So that was the sort of reason, if you like, for there not being anything in the 2015 budget, is because the government's saying, well, we're responding to the review now. Just as we're speaking, literally, there are bureaucrats from state and territory governments locked in dark rooms without windows, negotiating what's called the bilateral agreements around the NDIS. So that's happening as we speak. And they're negotiating about that whole business of what programs are in and what programs are out again. So they've looked at the trial sites of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and they're starting to see some of the data that's coming out of that, and they're testing their bilateral agreements. But they're about to make those agreements now. They'll be signed in ink by August. The government's COAG have agreed that those agreements will be signed. But it's essentially happening now. So we've got, after that, we're going to have some sort of response. The Commonwealth Government will respond to the National Mental Health Commission's report. So they've said that they'll respond by the end of the year. We take them at their word. So that puts their response somewhere then. We're not exactly sure where. The reason I put a little MyEFO there is the mid-year economic and financial outlook is a statement by the government. If it gets really bad, they call it a mini budget. It's essentially halfway through the financial year, so after the budget, 6 months after the budget, they release the mid-year economic and financial outlook. And what that says is, okay, we said this in the budget and now we're just revising our numbers. And so the mid-year economic and financial outlook statement is really important if you weren't in the budget of 2015, but you need to have programs in place by into 2016. You need government spending to be in the MyEFO. We're also presuming that by the end of the year that this fifth National Mental Health Plan will be agreed. Now the reason for having all of that there, the next opportunity for spend beyond that comes up. I'm waiting on my clicker. I seem to have stopped. Is that okay? Thank you. Seems the next opportunity for a spend comes in the 2016 budget. But you remember being the May budget, which is roughly on the timeline, remembering that we've got a whole raft of programs and services that are due to end here, a whole raft of them due to be rolled into the NDIS. Unless the spending is way back, then we're already in that NDIS transition time. And so the red zone, if you like, shifts with each of those deadlines. So as you can see, if there was agreement in MyEFO, so that's the statement that comes in November or December at the end of this year, then there might be enough time for us to get arrangements in place by June 30 of the following year. If it's not, then you see that the impact starts to shift out. And the further that red zone gets into this space here, the greater the impact that we've had on deteriorating programs and services. So that's why the timeline is so important. This picture, there's not a picture of this exactly, but it's a picture that's a bit like this, is up in one of the service providers that we use. They provide web design and all that sort of stuff. And they say basically that you can have three kinds of service from the organisation. It can be good, it can be cheap, or it can be quick. And they say that you can only have two of those things, which is to say, if you want it good and cheap, it can't be quick. If you want it quick, then you'll have to pay up somewhere else. And the fear that I have is that our government have really said, in effect, setting these timelines, at the moment, it's got to be fast. So that's a given. It's really fast tracking to be in place by December of this year for all of those things that I've talked about to be in place. So the fear is, of course, that if it's quick, are we going to sacrifice quality, or are we going to pay an awful lot to get it into place? And I can't yet see that government are committed to saying, okay, well, we want it quick, but we're prepared to pay. We need to solve this, and we need to solve it quickly, but we're prepared to pay. I can't see that unfolding just at the moment. So the next steps for us in terms of how we actually progress this, I think the first and most important thing is that we need to hold the Commonwealth Government to account for the reform agenda that they've and the timeline that they've set for themselves. And Mental Health Australia is building a bit of a campaign that you'll be invited, if you're a part of the space, to be contributing to, because what we're really saying now is we've waited long enough. Government have had their fair go. Government, you set the deadline. You said you were going to have these reforms in place by December this year. You said you'd have the fifth National Mental Health Plan committed. We need to hold government to account for those reforms. We also, based in Canberra, have a principal focus on the national government, the Commonwealth government. But my message to those of you at a state and territory level, as I get a chance to come and present like this, is to say, I really hope you're talking to your state government about the contribution and cooperation that they're making in relation to the 5th National Mental Health Plan. Because the easiest thing in the world for the Commonwealth government to say in 6 months' time would be, well, we tried to get up the 5th National Mental Health Plan, and you know what? States and territories. Trust them to get in our way again. So we wanted to do it, but we couldn't. So I think it's very important that at a local level there's pressure placed on state and territory governments to come to the negotiations around the 5th National Mental Health Plan in good faith. We also, I think, in the meantime, have to be working with a bit of a contingency plan in mind, which is to say all of this rollout might not happen as quickly as we anticipate and might not go exactly as planned. So what are we going to do? What are we going to put in place now to ensure that the services and programs that are in place for people aren't removed before new services and programs are put into place? And I think that'll be one of our big challenges. Finally, and I'll leave you with this thought, I think one of the most important things that we can be doing and that we need to keep saying is that we don't want a 12-month plan anymore. We don't want a 3-year plan anymore. We really need to ensure that governments commit to a long-term plan and a long-term vision. I think that's the only way we can break down some of this short-term sort of political thinking and chopping and changing that we get into all the time. So we had the 10-year roadmap for mental health 3 years ago. Now we're going to have a different plan. It's not good enough. And I think if there was one message that we could all commit to, I think, as a sector, it would be for us to be approaching all of our governments to be saying, we can't go on with this short-term vision anymore. We need a long-term plan for mental health reform. So that's what we'll be working on. As I said, my presentation wasn't really intended to try and solve all of those problems for government or for you. So I'm sorry if that's been a little bit of, if the sort of scale of the reform measures that are underway are a bit daunting. But I just think it's important that we as a sector who are in a position to influence governments have an opportunity to see that broader picture and have an opportunity, I think, to say to ourselves, well, how are we going to focus on the reform process? What steps can I, as an individual, take to ensure that longer term reform goal is met? So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to ask any questions about that if I haven't dribbled on a bit too long. Thanks.
Thanks, Frank. Look, we'll just have a couple of questions. We are running a bit late, but happy to have a couple of questions. And we've got 3 microphone elves. Julie over here, Rebecca there, and Paul on the side. We just invite you to ask a couple of questions. I suppose my immediate response was if we had as many plans for individuals as we do for systems, then it wouldn't be a very good system at all, would it? A question here, thanks.
Thanks for your speech. It was very informative. Not sure whether you can answer this or not. With the philosophy and the implementation of the NDIS, do you know whether that was how it was planned to be applied by the former government or whether its philosophy and implementation has changed with the new Commonwealth government?
Sure. I was lucky enough to be involved in many of the discussions under the previous government around establishing the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And I think it's fair to say that I think this government have maintained a pretty solid commitment to the underlying philosophy of the program, which, as you know, is built around this idea of individual choice and control. I have a lot of respect for Mitch Fifield, who's the principal minister with responsibility in this area. But none of that's to say that I also think this government are bumping into some of the problems that were created by the fact that planning around the NDIS was so rushed So I don't know if you remember, the politics of it was that it came up prior to the election, and as a result we got into this sort of quick bid war where all of a sudden governments were committed to an NDIS considerably sooner than had originally been planned. And I think that's why we're facing some of the issues that we're facing now. And in the mental health space, that's even worse, because the original Productivity Commission report that recommended we establish an NDIS, the draft report said that mental health should be excluded. And then there was a lot of political argy-bargy at the time, and eventually the final report said it should be included, and it was included. But I think what that meant was that a lot of the really detailed, systematic thinking that the Productivity Commission had done around other disability types was not done in the mental health space. And so we're playing catch-up a bit, and I think we're facing the consequence of that. As I said, I don't blame the government for that, but I do just acknowledge that we are playing catch-up, especially in the mental health space, and that's really challenging.
Thanks, Frank. One more question? Gone. Thank you very much, Frank. Do you join me in thanking Frank? I found that most informative, and it's probably the most succinct and clear summary of the directions that we're going that I've ever heard. So I really appreciate it. Thanks, Frank.